There is a kind of a protracted discussion that we should have, or that you guys should have amongst yourselves, about the relative merits of analog recording versus digital recording. And I've been doing it. I've been making records for a long time. I've been exposed to a lot of different circumstances, and I have drawn conclusions. So I'm not a good person to speak to if you want to maintain like an ambivalence about it. I'm convinced and remain and get more convinced every day that digital recording is inappropriate for making records. It's not a suitable technology for making records, and my complaints with it have nothing whatsoever to do with sound quality or the aura of analog recording or any of the warm, fuzzy, vague things that people normally attribute to people like me who don't use digital recording. It doesn't work properly, and it's a destructive influence. That's what I don't like about it. Let me just tell you, I'll start at the beginning of my exposure to sound and music. I first started playing in a band in 1978. I was in a punk rock band in Montana, and that band wanted to record itself, so we rented a 4-track tape machine from the guitar store, and we recorded ourselves. And that was my first significant experience making recordings. From there, I went to a few sessions at the one professional recording studio in our town, and I was sort of intrigued by the process, and it occurred to me that that might be an interesting way to spend my time, although I didn't pursue that as a vocation. I didn't try to make that the focus of my education or anything. I moved to Chicago in 1980 to go to school at Northwestern University. I studied journalism, and while I was in school, I was in bands, and all my friends were in bands. And my bands needed to record themselves, or wanted to record themselves, and all my friends' bands wanted to record themselves. So because I'd had a little bit of experience with it, I became sort of the default guy that my friends would ask to record their band's demos. And the term demo is kind of an unusual one, but it's an enlightening one. The term demo means demonstration. Like, this is a demonstration of our band's songwriting ability, or demonstration of our ability to play for you so that you can have us in your nightclub or whatever. But all of the demos that I was recording weren't demonstrating anything. They were almost keepsakes in a way. Like, the bands wanted to record themselves because they wanted some evidence of their existence. And they were called demos because there was no convenient term for it other than that. And at the time, there was no hope, or very little hope, of any of these bands releasing a record. At the time, it was very difficult to really self-release a record, and there were very few labels that were independent of the mainstream music industry, so there were no avenues to release your music. So bands would record demos and pass cassettes around, and that was how they satisfied themselves. Their creative impulse was satisfied on a very small scale. The band I was in, a band called Big Black, recorded a record. Then a couple of my friends' bands recorded records, and we eventually started a record label called Ruthless Records, which was a collaborative record label. Each of the bands was responsible for making and paying for its own recordings, but we did all of the shipping and billing from one address, and that made it seem like we were a for-real record label, and it made it seem like the distributors would have to pay us in order to get more of these records. But it was really just a loose aggregation of independent bands paying their own way, making their own records. Then, from the exposure that those records got, I started getting calls from bands that I had never met about them wanting me to work on their records. And so over time, it developed in a very, very, very methodical fashion. I went from being a guy who recorded in people's houses and practice rooms to being a guy who worked freelance at recording studios occasionally, to all of this being done in the part-time of my real job, in the spare time from my real job, to ultimately a guy who was working in recording studios pretty much all the time. Around that time, in 1986, when I quit my straight job, I built a studio in my house, and it was a proper studio with playing rooms and isolation and control room and all that sort of stuff, but it was in my house. And that was the first time that I started charging money for my services. It was when I invested my own money in building a place for recording. I felt like I should get paid for doing that. So I started charging for my time. Carrying on after that, that carried on for 10 years, something like that. 8 years, somewhere in there. Then in 1995, things were going so well at the studio in my house that I didn't have any privacy and I didn't have any time, and there were people overrunning my house and I didn't have any place to live. So I bought a big building and built a big fancy recording studio, and that's where I am now. That big fancy recording studio is called Electrical Audio, and it's a 2-studio complex in Chicago, 11,000 square feet. It was all custom, it was all built expressly for being a recording studio. It's not a converted warehouse space or anything like that. It was built as a recording studio. And that's where I'll probably be for the rest of my life. The philosophies that I take into the recording studio are very straightforward. Because I've been a band member myself, because I've been in bands and I've been in studios as a paying client, I have a perspective on a recording engineer's place. It always offended me when I was in the studio as a musician or with one of my friends' bands, and the engineer or the assumed producer for the session would start bossing the band around and telling them what to do and telling them how to behave and screwing with them. That always seemed like a horrible insult to me, because the band were paying money for the privilege of being in the recording studio, and normally when you pay for something you get to say how it's done. That's just sort of how it goes normally. You go to the barber, you pay for your haircut, you get to tell them how to cut your hair. And it seemed like a perversion of that somebody would be paying to go into a studio in order to be bossed around by somebody else. So I made up my mind when I started engineering professionally that I wasn't going to behave like that. I was going to take the band seriously and let the bands be in charge. My early experiences in the studio did have some good experiences with the studio paradigm as it was then. In the 70s and 80s, there weren't as many recording studios as there are now. Because there were fewer of them, they were taken more seriously by the people that worked there, and they were taken more seriously by the people who used them. And there was a sort of a minimum level of competence that was expected of anyone who was working professionally in a recording studio. Because there were so few jobs available, it was presumed that if you had a job, it was because you were good at your job. And speaking very generally, all of the engineers during that period knew the technical side of the studio. That is, they knew how the studio was physically built. They knew what the installation was like. They knew the function and processes for all of the equipment that they would be asked to use. And generally speaking, they were operating on a conversational level with the equipment. The equipment wasn't a mysterious black box that did something at random and that they had to hope would work. They had an understanding of it. They could tell it what to do and it would do it. All engineers had some musical training of some kind. Generally, it was limited to things like being able to play the piano a little bit, but at least that meant they could follow along on a score, or they could count measures appropriately, that sort of stuff. There was some musical training that allowed them to be conversational with the musicians and allowed them to understand what was happening. And because there was a relatively small market for recording studios and the equipment was technologically advanced for its day, there was no cheap equipment. There was no chintzy, crappy recording equipment. There was only professional quality equipment available. Crappy equipment started to creep into the game in the 80s, but up until say the early 1980s, any studio that was operating was going to be operating with equipment that was of a professional caliber. So all that stuff was good. The bad part of the engineering culture or the recording culture in the 70s and 80s was that engineers would presume themselves to be the producers of every session. Unless there was a nominal producer, unless there was someone brought in who was told to them, this is a producer, he's going to be producing a session, the engineers would presume the mantle of producer and start taking charge of things. Most engineers, acting defensively, had a method for how they would do things. They had a very specific method. This is how I record guitars. This is how I record a session. I always start with the bass and drums first, and then we overdub everything. We always play to a click track. Things like that. There was a method that was ingrained in their minds as the only way that you could make a record. It was like there was a single program that every band that came through the door would be expected to follow. The musicians weren't taken seriously. Bands and musicians were presumed to be dumb talent. That is, their opinions didn't matter because the engineer presumed that he had a lot more experience and that he was a lot smarter and that he had his method worked out, and as long as the band complied, then he would be happy. Because of that, the tastes of engineers and the amusements of the engineers dominated the sessions. And come the mid-1980s, a few very specific things changed in technology which allowed that paradigm, that is, the recording engineer as producer, as boss of the session, to horribly scar music. There was a drum machine called the Linn drum that was invented that was sort of the darling of the engineering community in the 80s. In their minds, it was just like a drummer, except that it was always in time and every stroke sounded exactly the same. And in my mind, that means that it's nothing like a drummer, and you shouldn't consider them equivalents. But they were used as equivalents in the day, and there were also a lot of MIDI synthesizers showing up where a limitless variety of sounds were available that the engineer could dig around with in his spare time and then impose on the sessions. There was also a sort of beginning event of a very stylized aesthetic where records became more and more produced and more layers of more and more abstract sounds were added to the records. And generally speaking, this wasn't done at the behest of the bands. Like very few bands would lay awake at night dreaming about the time that the drum kit would sound like a mechanical sneeze, for example. But an awful lot of records came out during that period where the drum kit sounded like a mechanical sneeze. And that was clearly coming from somewhere. This extra musical, superimposed aesthetic was coming from somewhere. Where it was coming from it was coming from an incredibly arrogant mentality in the recording community. The culture of recording engineers and producers was imposing this abstraction on the bands. And as a result, the music of that era sounds very dated. It sounds comical now because there are all of these absurd choices that were made at the behest of the engineer purely for his own amusement. And he has saddled, for example, a hard rock band with this ridiculous Yamaha DX7 keyboard sound and a Roland jazz chorus and a Rockman guitar part. None of those things came organically with the band. They were imposed after the fact. That mentality, that process, that abstraction offended me at the time because I was in a band and I didn't think bands deserved that. Bands didn't deserve to have their stuff messed with to that degree. The freakishness of the sound of that period, and of any period, in any period there's a freakish margin of sound. The freakish sound is temporarily diverting, but it's ultimately irrelevant. It created a lot of records that were temporarily popular because of novelty, but the records of that period that became landmarks, that are the ones that people think about now as being important records, and the ones that have remained influential, were by and large the more simplistic, more naturalistic recordings. Like, there's a case to be made that Wang Chung in their day were way more important than the Ramones because they sold a lot more records. They appeared in a lot more perfume commercials, and they were in a lot more movie soundtracks. I don't know of anyone now that has publicly acknowledged Wang Chung as an influence in the last few years, but everyone acknowledges the Ramones as an influence. So that's a simplistic reading of it, but that's an example. During that same period, during the period of the 80s, I was in bands. I was in the band Big Black and then Rape Man, and I'm in a band called Shellac now. And maintaining familiarity with live band the live band experience, I think, is really important if you want to work with live bands. If you want to work with bands that are self-contained, you have to have a familiarity with what happens inside of bands. There's the internal compromises that are always made. There are the give and take within the band between the members. There's the group dynamic. There's the trajectory of the long arc of a career. All of those things are important to the band. And if you want to do service to the band, if you want to do a job for them, you have to understand those things. And there's no way to understand them better than by being a part of it. And if you're not in a band, at very least you owe it to yourself to understand that culture, to understand the social organization which is a band. I gradually started attracting the attention of more and more bands, some from overseas. I've made a bunch of records for a bunch of different bands, and over time, I was asked to make a few more high-profile records. Probably the most famous people that I've worked with would be the Pixies, PJ Harvey, Nirvana, Jimmy Page and Robert Plant. And those are probably the most famous bands that I've worked with. Those occurrences, that is, those big records where there's a record label involved and there's a reasonable budget and there's a lot of attention being paid to the release of the record, those records are very few and far between. I've made well over 1,000 records, probably as many as 1,500, and I've probably made 6 or 8 that would fall into the category of major releases by major record labels. So the idea that's normal, that is working on major records with big budgets and a lot of money behind them and a lot of attention being paid to them, it's a delusion to think that that's normal. That is a freakish occurrence. It's on a par with the appearance of a comet or some other big celestial event. It doesn't happen very often. You shouldn't gear your studies and your attention toward things like that because they don't happen very often. And if you spend your time and energy thinking about how would I do this in this sort of big indulgent manner, if I had a limitless budget, if I was in a fantastic studio and I had a limitless calendar of opportunities ahead of me, how would I do this? Is not a very productive exercise. It's not productive because you're only going to be in those circumstances once or twice in your life. It doesn't make sense to hone skills that you're only ever going to use once or twice. What you should do is you should spend your time and energy getting the nuts and bolts down. Learn how to do every basic task that's required of an engineer, and everything else will follow. The nuts and bolts is about 99% of the job. I'm asked often about mixing records, like what do you do when you're mixing this record? You know, what is your mode? Like, do you use a lot of compression? Do you use a lot of EQ? Do you like to mix to this format or that format? 99% of mixing is moving the faders up and down until you find where it sounds good and then leaving them alone. That's the majority of the job. Getting the balance together, that is not screwing with the sound, not dreaming up elaborate effects, not manipulating the sound, just finding a place where the fader sounds best. That's 99% of the job. All the other stuff is in the margins. Every other decision that you make is in the margins. The great majority of what you're doing is solving problems. And the more experience you have and the more you understand the technical aspect of what you're doing, the easier it becomes to solve those problems. I've made records in as little as I've made record albums that is full 45 minute to an hour long albums in 1 day, in 2 days, in 3 days, a week, 2 weeks. Anything longer than a week is pretty rare for me. The majority of the records that I work on are done in less than a week. The longest I've ever spent working on a record was 4 months, but that was a unique and absurd set of circumstances. And that's only happened to me once. Other than that, I think the most I've ever spent on a record is a couple of weeks. Keeping that pace of work up is necessary given that the budgets for each individual record are small and I have a high overhead to operate the studio. So I have to work a lot. But I think it's also good for me. I think it's good for, in the same way that it's good for a guy to take batting practice if he wants to be ready for a game. I think it's good to keep your skills on point and to do a lot of work, to spend as much of your time recording as you possibly can. The reason being that the more you do it, the more you become familiar with it, the more your vocabulary of solutions enlarges. And so when a problem presents itself, you can choose from a series of solutions that you've already tried out in other circumstances before you go into a big experimental binge. And there is something to be said for experimenting, but I don't think that that's the way you should start out. I do think experimenting is important. I think you should read. There's been an awful lot written about the science and the practice of sound recording. And it's very important for you to read, study, and experiment in that order, and then begin the cycle again. If you're just experimenting and you don't learn anything from those experiments, if you're fucking around at random and you get an interesting sound, but then you never go back to teach yourself why it was an interesting sound, then it was a one-time experience, sort of like a fireworks show that you'll never be able to recreate. But if you learn from your experiments, if you learn why what you were doing worked, then you'll be able to call on that in the same circumstances later. Along the way, as an engineer, I developed a reputation. And my reputation has two prongs. One is that I am an anti-digital engineer. I think that's overstating the case. I don't use digital recording, but not because I am opposed to it. I don't use digital recording because it's inappropriate for the work that I do. I do permanent recording of records that are intended to last forever. They are the history of the band that I'm working with at the moment, and it is vitally important to them. I owe it to them to have that record be available to them, at very least to them, and hopefully to the rest of the world, forever. And the only realistic way to do that is by recording to analog tape. I have yet to come across a circumstance where I couldn't accomplish what I needed to do using analog techniques. And I have yet to come across a circumstance where I felt like the flexibility afforded by digital recording would have been a deciding factor in the possibility of making a record or not. So I found no need to use digital recording, and I don't consider it appropriate for making records, but I'm not opposed to it. I think it's perfectly appropriate for informal demos, for sound production for news gathering, jingles, video games, movie soundtracks. In short, I think it's fine for most stuff that doesn't matter to me. And in fact, it's probably ideal for stuff that doesn't matter to me. Records matter a lot to me. I think records are vitally important. Records are one of the few pieces of direct evidence that we can have connecting one generation to the next, and I think they're vitally important. Because I think they're important, I think it's the bare minimum that we can expect of an engineer working on a record is that he creates something permanent, creates something that can be put on a shelf and taken off in 20 years and played. And so far, that does not exist in the digital paradigm. Nothing like that exists. There are strategies that could be implemented to continually refresh data and continually update formats so that things could be made available in the future in the digital paradigm. No one is doing that sort of work, even those people who have billions of dollars tied up in assets. No one is doing this sort of refreshing of an archive, and I think it's completely fantastic to assume that at some point in the future, everyone is going to change the way they behave and start doing it. So, if only for reasons of historical necessity, I think analog recording will always be with us. The other prong of my reputation is that I am anti-industry. And I think that's overstated as well. I am opposed to exploitation by anyone of anyone. I think it's crass that an entire industry has developed where such business practices are considered the norm, and I don't choose to participate in that industry. I have done records for bands who are involved in the mainstream record industry, and they and I both know that they're not getting a fair shake, and all I can do is have sympathy for them. I have sympathies, my sympathies are always with the bands, and I have little to no respect for people within the music industry who are taking advantage of them. That said, it's none of my business what other people do, and so I can't say that I have a position with regards to the industry as a whole. I do choose to behave in a way that I'm comfortable, and it has proven to be a very successful method in terms of my longevity. I've been able to make records for a very long time. I work with a wide variety of clients. My clients are happy, and I know, as an added benefit for myself, I know that I'm not taking advantage of them. I'd be happy to answer specific questions about my relationship with the greater music industry if you want to, but I don't want to bore anybody who's not interested. The second meaning of the word industry is that it describes people who are industrious. That is, people who go out of their way to make things, even at their own, even to their own detriment. They do things and make things that are of value. And I admire industry in that regard. I admire people who are industrious, and I admire their industry. So my relationship to the music industry is also two-pronged. Most of the problems relating to my relationship with the music industry relate to business practices of show business as a whole, specific to the recording industry, because that's what I'm most familiar with. In terms of my own personal business practices, I charge as little as I can possibly afford. And the reason that I do that is that I feel better about making 3 records during a certain period of time and having all 3 of my clients be happy than I would about making 1 record during that same period of time and having that client be happy. I feel more comfortable with the idea that I'm a bargain than that I am in some way triumphing in a business relationship. I don't like negotiating. I think it's tacky. I think negotiating makes me look greedy and it makes my client look cheap, and I don't think either one of us is flattered by that. So I have a set fee for virtually everything that I do. The recording studio that I built is a wonderful recording studio, and we lease it out at what I consider very, very cheap rates. But everybody pays the same rate. There are no deals, there's no winking, nobody gets special treatment, nobody gets, industry discounts or whatever. Everybody plays by the same rules. I don't use contracts, I don't have a lawyer, I don't have a cell phone. I have email, but I seldom look at it. The best way to get in touch with me is by calling me on the telephone. And that's because I don't have voicemail. I like the idea that when someone calls me, they're actually going to get me. They're not going to get some, relationship management software that will then keep them at a distance. When I'm contacted by a band, I prefer to talk to the band directly rather than talking to a manager or a record label or booking agent, because communication is so much easier. I think it's vitally important that a band know how much money they're going to spend when they make a record. And having a conversation about money at the very beginning of the conversation about making the record is the first way to make sure that everyone is operating on an even playing field. Make sure that everybody's comfortable with money and everything else is fine. Because money is the only thing ultimately that anybody ever cries about. There have been some questions prepared of me. I haven't looked at them. So you'll be getting a spontaneous response.
The first set of questions are going to be questions about personal recordings, like with shellac and that kind of stuff. Basically, the first question is, in your personal recordings, you have very interesting guitar tones. How do you approach getting your own tone? What's your philosophy, that kind of thing?
I've used the same basic equipment for a very long time, and I think that's why I'm comfortable. I have a kind of a freakish guitar sound. A lot of you may not be familiar with my band. My guitar sound is not a conventional rock guitar sound. It's kind of clanky and annoying. But because it's familiar to me, I'm fluent with it, and I can play it in a way that is satisfying. And I think idiosyncratic sounds like that are based on a level of commitment. You have to choose to like something and then adapt your skills to it. That's sort of the way I've done it.
As far as your clients, do you try to influence the sound of your clients when you don't really like or agree with their sound, or do you try to stay true to it as possible?
That's an interesting question. At the root of that is the idea that when I go into a session, I have a preconceived set of ideas about what something should sound like. Pardon me. And I don't. I have to say, I I think anything is fair game. So if a band shows up and they want to make a record that I wouldn't choose to buy as a fan or as a listener, it's their record and they're allowed to do that. If I understand what they're trying to do and they feel like they're failing, then I might make suggestions to help them get to where they're headed. But I think it's completely beyond the scope of my job to start making corrective making corrective adjustments in the way a band sounds. I don't think that's fair to the band, and I don't do it.
Yeah, so what are some of your personal favorite recordings that you have engineered, and what makes them stand out from a multitude of others?
It's hard for me to separate the recording sessions from the recordings. Like there are sessions that I've done that were really a blast, and I really liked those sessions, and that sort of makes me nostalgic and fond of those records, whether the records are any good or not. But if I rating them purely on the sonics, I think I was very fond of the records I did with the Jesus Lizard in the 90s. They were a great band, and they were playing really well, and their recordings are very bold, very like bare, and I like the way those records came out. I did a record for the Pixies, and then Kim Deal, the bass player from the Pixies, had started a band called the Breeders, and I did a record for the Breeders shortly thereafter. And the Pixies became really popular, and that baffled me because I thought they were a trivial band. But I really liked the Breeders. I thought the Breeders were a really interesting, really unique. They were a unique band, and I liked them a lot. I liked the way the records came out. Kim carried on with the band for a while, and then took a few years off, and then came back. In 97 or 98, she started work on another album, and I got to work on that album, and I liked that album a lot as well. I did a couple of records for Will Oldham. He puts records out under the name Palace, and Will Oldham and Bonnie Prince Billy, and I like those records. There's a lady from New York named Nina Nastasia. She's got this big elaborate band with a bunch of different people in it. Like she's got 12 instruments at times, and I really like the way her records came out. Done 3 records with her. You know, and then there were a lot of records that I had an affection for that I don't think anybody else would like. Yeah, there's some sort of Blinding Noise records that I really enjoyed from the 70s and the 80s, like the early industrial music before industrial became a synonym for disco. There was a sort of a wing of noisy music that was really intriguing to me because it was really brutish and really ugly. And I did a couple of records with Whitehouse, who were sort of the most brutish and ugly of those bands, and I really liked that stuff. Yeah, it's hard to explain what makes me think of it. I mean, if you make records every day, after a while, records are unremarkable. So it takes something perverse or exceptional to make you think highly of that record. And then the other problem is that if you listen to a record 100 times, it doesn't matter if it's a great record or not. If you listen to it 100 times, you get sick of it. And when you're making a record, you're going to get sick of that record. And it sometimes takes 4 or 5 years before you've forgotten that you hate it, and then you'll hear it in the background somewhere and think, oh, that's really cool. I like that, you know. So.
When recording, what is the most important factor to getting a good sound on tape?
Making the band comfortable for the live take. Generally speaking, I work mostly with self-contained bands. That is a band that plays together and operates as a unit. And so I like to start the session out with them all playing together the way they do every day so that they're comfortable and normal. And the band's level of comfort with the studio environment and with what they're doing is the #1 factor. If they're playing well, almost any sound will be fine. Like, you can listen to a lot of different records and think that they sound great. And if you compare them on a sort of a microscopic level, they sound quite different. And there are some things about them that you might even describe as flaws. But what makes them great is the greatness, you know. And the sound quality, in a lot of instances, is kind of irrelevant.
Fair enough. Let's see. As far as engineering, What's your approach to getting a good overall drum sound?
Same basic thing. Make sure that don't fuck with the drummer. That's basically it. Like don't. I've seen a lot of sessions sort of grind to a halt when the drummer has been made insecure for whatever reason. Like, okay, you're going to play along to this metronome. No, you're speeding up. No, you're slowing down now. Now you're speeding up. You know, making a drummer concentrate on a problem is a very good way of making him play poorly. And the playing style and the playing technique are the most important things about the drum sound. From a technical standpoint, I tend to like a very naturalistic recording. That is, I don't like to dampen the drums necessarily. I like to make sure there's a good acoustic sound coming off the drums, and I like to try to capture it, try to record that as accurately as possible as a starting point. The most important thing is to have a conversation with the band, have a conversation with the drummer, make sure that you understand what they want. If what they want is a big booming sound, and what they have is a very dry, very broken down drum kit, you'll have to move from there. You'll have to explain that, you know, the equipment they're playing on is not appropriate for the sound they're after. Then you can give them the option of playing with what they've got, or bringing in another drum kit, or, you know, there's any number of things that you can do. But the important thing to do is to find out what they want first. There are a million little technical details about recording drums that are sort of best answered on an individual basis, but if you guys have any specific questions you want to ask about later, I can get to that.
As far as each session goes, do you find yourself approaching sessions in the same manner, or do you try to do different things with each recording?
I don't consciously go into a session with anything in mind. Like, there are techniques that you develop over time that are more reliable than others in certain circumstances. And after you've had a conversation with the band and you understand what they want to do, then you go to your like menu of choices and start using things that have worked in those circumstances in the past. I realize I'm speaking very generally here, and y'all want an answer like, yeah, you put a tunnel around the bass drum and that'll do it for you. But there really aren't such answers. There are people who will pretend that there are such answers, but you do really have to pay attention. You have to listen to the band, understand what they want, and then work from their expectations or work from their desires.
As far as working in the studio with the artists, are there any tips that you would like to give people on what not to do?
Don't get uppity. That's the number one thing. Remember your place. You are employed by the band. They are in charge. They get to tell you what to do. You don't get to tell them what to do. That's the number one thing to do. Like, I have seen far too many people start their sessions by running the band ragged, like making them do things for them. And I think that's really rude and demeaning, and it is an inversion of the power structure. So the number one thing would be know your place. Like, don't get uppity.
About recording in general, what is your overall thoughts on compression and the overall lack of dynamics in most recordings today?
There's been a trend for the last 10 years or so in mastering to make records louder and louder, or more apparently loud. And the means of doing that is to limit and compress the signal so that the aggregate volume comes up without the peaks going beyond the limited digital headroom. And that has translated down into a bunch of individual sounds. Like, it seems like there's a presumption that you're going to compress sounds in the minds of a lot of recording engineers. And I tend to use compression to solve problems only. Like, about the only instrument that I routinely record using compression is vocals. Like, the dynamic range of a vocalist is really dramatic. It can be, 70, 80 dB of active dynamic range. And you do need to restrain that somewhat in order for it to be, that to be useful within the context of a bunch of other instruments. So vocals I tend to use compression on. And almost everything else is on a case-by-case basis. Like, if the bass guitar isn't sustaining enough, I might use some compression on the bass guitar. If the bass drum sounds too thin, I might use some compression on the bass drum. But in those cases, I'm talking about a couple of dB of work at most. I'm not... The sound of music being freaked by compression is a charming sound the first time you hear it. Like the first time you hear what happens when you turn that knob all the way up and say, wow, that sounds crazy, that's great. You've got to get over that because it's a temporary little titillation. You know, the sound of something being roasted by a compressor is now such a brutal cliche, you know, and it's really a brutal cliche, and it's not accomplishing anything. To have a record that sounds like every other record is no feat. There's no accomplishment there. Like, yes, we're going to crush everything with compression so that we will sound just like all the other beer commercials out there. You know? It's not an accomplishment, and there's nothing novel about it. And the biggest problem is that it tends to flatten everything, and the presentation ends up being so similar to all of the other records that are made with a lot of compression that the individuality of the band disappears. You no longer can tell that you're listening to this band rather than that band.
Okay, kind of similar, but what are your thoughts on the use of auto-tune to fix vocals and otherwise make it sound unnatural?
Ultimately, you guys can do whatever you want, and you know, I'm not going to point fingers or make fun of anybody, but auto-tuning is really ugly. Like, I don't particularly care about whether somebody's singing in tune or not singing in tune, but when they sound like Stephen Hawking, that's gone beyond. And again, this is another one of those situations where the engineer feels like his perspective is more important than anybody else's. Like the engineer, like, well, that sounds out of tune, and I can fix it in finger quotes, so I should. And that's a hubristic presumption on the part of the engineer. You know, people talk a lot about how the only reason people are using auto-tune now is because nobody can sing anymore. That's a load of crap. People can sing as well and as poorly as they always have. There's really no distinction. I guarantee you, if Ella Fitzgerald were making a record this afternoon, some snotty engineer would run her through auto-tune. And she had perfect pitch, which she could demonstrate on a daily basis. I guarantee you somebody would put auto-tune on her. And it's being done defensively out of the fear that it might be out of tune. And operating in fear is a terrible way to make something that is supposed to stand as a strong statement. It's a terrible way to make something sound bold by making it sound timid.
It's really easy to make music these days with like laptops and Pro Tools and all that fun stuff in the digital domain. What effect do you think this will have on music?
I don't think you can affect music on the whole, right? I think there will be a subgenre of like garage band music that people make on their iPods and stuff, or their Segways. Which one is it? Is it a Segway or an iPod? I think that all these technologies have this sort of like novelty factor when they first come out, and everybody's charmed by them, everybody plays around with them, and everybody makes interesting telephone answering machine messages for a while. But none of them make a difference ultimately. None of them are like the defining aspect of a period of music. I think, you know, getting people interested and involved in making music is of itself a good thing. So getting more people active on a personal level in making music, I think is good for our culture. So it doesn't bug me. And like I said, I think all of these digital tools are appropriate for fucking around in the dorm. You know, I think they're perfectly great for that, and I think they're fine for informal stuff. I don't think that as a professional, I don't think that I should use these sort of video game caliber things to make records. I just feel like I'm not doing a service to my clients by doing that.
Here's some questions about electrical audio specifically. What are some of the things you try to do differently when building electrical audio, like something unique you try to accomplish?
There's a website for electrical audio. So this is the website for electrical audio. And if you can go to this website, it's just www.electrical.com. And if you go to the studios part of it, you can see the different studios, and there's, if you go to the studios bit, you can see the individual studios. There's pictures and everything. And then in the, I'll just go to Studio A because that one's come up already. There's there are construction detail drawings and that sort of stuff. So you can, there's like a description of the studio, and then there's pictures of the rooms. When you get to a for real computer that's a little bit quicker, you can see there are construction details of the different studios. There's a complete inventory of equipment. There's descriptions. There's little sort of, there's a forum where people can ask questions of the studio. Like you can ask our technical staff questions about the equipment. You can, all that sort of stuff. I'm kind of hoping at some point in my life to get to a point where I don't actually have to answer as many phone calls as I do right now. Right now I still have to answer the phone every time it rings because somebody has a question and I have to answer it. I would love it to be that I could just say to anybody that calls, have you seen the website? Because your question is answered on the website. And I would really love to be able to do that, just have a completely comprehensive website that answers every question. And then I wouldn't have to drive down to Tennessee, I wouldn't, you know. And that's what we're shooting for. Eventually we will get there. But so yeah, as regards electrical, any questions about electrical audio, just go to the electrical website and it's probably answered there.
When you get an intern at your place, what does that normally consist of, the experience, and what are your thoughts on internships?
I have a kind of an unusual perspective on internships in that as a business owner and a boss, I like to think of myself as a good boss. That is, I don't take advantage of my employees. And I don't expect more from them than is reasonable. And the relationship between a boss and an intern is sort of inherently unequal, and that makes me uncomfortable. That is, the intern is there because he has an interest and an enthusiasm for something, and I'm exploiting that enthusiasm and making him change the cat box, or empty the garbage cans, things like that. So I'm uncomfortable with that relationship, and so we don't generally take interns. We do occasionally take interns who are required to do an internship as part of an academic program, because then at least they're getting something out of it. And we will also occasionally take interns from foreign countries, because a lot of foreign countries have these work training programs where they will pay to send a kid to America to learn how to do something. And that's a great experience for the kid, so I feel good about that as well. Like, we've had a couple of French interns, and we've had one from Australia and a Japanese kid. And I kind of feel like that's a valid thing, giving this kid the opportunity to go to America and chase women for a year. That's a valid trade there. But generally speaking, I feel like as an employer, if I need somebody to empty my garbage, I should bite the bullet and hire somebody to empty the garbage. I shouldn't, fob it off on interns. I think that's kind of creepy.
So questions about the music industry. Your article, The Problem with Music, shed light on the state of most record label operations. Would you say trends are changing at all, or are labels still making artists wait their experiment for a deal?
The behavior of the record business hasn't changed in 75 years. I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. Like the music business exists to sort of perpetuate itself. It doesn't exist for the benefit of the artists, and I think that's always going to be the case. I just wanted to point something out on this website here. Notice John Novotny is bald in the back right here. Okay, this is John Novotny. He's our office manager. He likes to say he's part Eskimo. And then when somebody says, really, Eskimo, he corrects them and says, we prefer Inuit. So he gives them the word and then he takes it back. That's really fun. But, okay, I want to point out here, notice that he's got no hair back here, okay? Now, I'm going to show you a little, we have a lounge at Electrical Audio. There's a billiard table. Okay, here's John Novotny. Come on, where's the phone? Okay. Notice that there's been hair photoshopped in. It's one of my favorite things about the website.
This is going back to the music industry. Is dealing with an indie label any different than dealing with a major label as far as fees?
Yes, dealing with indie labels is much, much, much easier than dealing with major labels. Indie labels pay their bills, major labels don't. Indie labels will not bullshit you. Generally speaking, indie labels are run by entrepreneurial, one or two people who are acting as entrepreneurs, who've invested their own money and their own time in something. Major labels are run by a sort of a bureaucracy of people. Everybody is responsible to somebody else and nobody can make an absolute decision about anything. So when dealing with major labels, it's vitally important to get the money before you do anything else. Tell them that you can't book the time until they've sent you the money, and if they start bossing you around, look elsewhere. I mean, just pass on the work, because if you wait for them to pay you, you'll be waiting until kingdom come. So, yes, independent labels are generally better than major labels. There are a few bad independent labels that are sort of acting like pretend major labels, little dollhouse major labels. But by and large, an independent label is much easier to work with than a major label.
So you work with a lot of unsigned bands. That seems to be a big part of your repertoire. What do you recommend when you work with them, as far as like maybe working with labels or even selling records?
There are two kinds of unsigned bands. There are bands that are operating on an independent level and are self-sufficient, like they book their own shows, they sell records at venues, or they sell records through distribution on their own. And then there are bands that are only unsigned because they haven't succeeded in getting signed yet. And those bands I have no advice for, because ultimately, if you get signed to a record label, it's because that record label has taken an interest in you directly, and there's nothing that I can tell you that will make that happen. If you're operating as an independent band, that is a band making and selling your own records, doing your own touring, supporting yourself that way, there's a whole raft of things. There's everything from like strategies for keeping the business side of it from interfering with the music side of it. It's an involved conversation. It's sort of like saying, how do you run a farm? You know, there's a lot to it. But at that point, an independent band is operating as an entrepreneurial business on its own. And as an entrepreneurial businessman, I have a lot of experience with that I can help them with. If a band is unsigned but wants to be signed, ultimately that's like the whims of fate and them finding a record label that's appropriate for them. And I really don't have any advice about that.
Okay, one last question for me. What is your opinion on the difference between a producer and an engineer? And why do you prefer being called an engineer?
Producers were originally part of a vertical monopoly system that record labels and entertainment companies had. And in some cases, there was an extra tier to the vertical monopoly. It would start at the bottom with a pool of songwriters. Then that would filter up to the artist and repertoire department, who would select the songs and then select an artist to perform those songs. And then a producer would be responsible for making the technical and creative decisions to execute the recording of those songs, and then that would go to the record label, which would then make a decision about making and promoting the record, which would then go out through retail outlets and through radio stations, often all owned by the same company. Sort of a big vertical monopoly where all the decisions remained inside one building. And that's the way, for example, RCA and EMI and Columbia and even Motown, to name a much later example, operated. Very much vertical monopolies. So the producer was responsible to all the people behind him in the chain for making saleable records. He wasn't responsible to the people below him. That is, which artist he was working on at the moment was immaterial to him, because he didn't have to answer to the artist. He had to answer to the people in the sales department. And by the same token, the A&R people didn't have to answer to the singers and songwriters. They had to answer to the record producers and all the salespeople above them. So that's where a record producer came from. It was sort of a middle management position within a record company. Those people, a lot of them came from technical backgrounds and some of them came from musical backgrounds, but their position was always to produce records for the sales staff to sell. That term has been sort of parallel applied to people who are operating outside of that studio system, who are taking on themselves to make creative decisions for records. Like they're sort of analogous to a film director in a way, although a film director doesn't have as much direct control over his movie as a record producer has over the record. And that is making the creative decisions about the record under question. That's not what I do, and so it's not accurate for me to call myself a producer. In almost virtually every record I've ever worked on, the band has been making those decisions. Production decisions have been made by the band, so the band would qualify as the producer, not me.
Okay, I think we're going to open the floor for questions from the audience there.
That record in particular was unusual for me in that every song had a completely different setup for the guitar. There would be a different guitar, different amplifiers, sometimes a couple of amplifiers, sometimes completely different recording arrangement for the first part and then for the middle part and then the end part. And that was all of that stuff was decided on by Jimmy Page. So there were times when he'd say, I want a little more room on the guitar, so I'd either put up a room mic or move the mic back farther from the cabinet. But I couldn't tell you how the guitar was recorded because it was different on every song. It was, generally speaking, a mic close to the cabinet, sometimes a couple of mics close to the cabinet, sometimes a couple of mics on each cabinet for several cabinets, and then sometimes an ambient mic as well. There really wasn't a single method, so I can't answer the question definitively, sorry. But basically, Jimmy Page called the shots on that. So. I don't have much pull with Robert Plant, although my sister does. I've been waiting for a long time to use that one. Basically, those guys have sort of carried on with their careers, you know, regardless of all outside influence. I have a lot of respect for both of those guys. I think they're pretty amazing as individuals. You know, they're the only people I know they're the only people I know personally who have genuinely lived like kings. You know, and that they can even relate to us mere mortals in a common language. I find it astounding. Because if I had lived like them, I guarantee you that I wouldn't want to touch common folk. The Recording Industry Association of America is an industry lobby group, and it's almost exactly the same as, like, you know, the toxic waste industry or whatever. The lobbying interests of that group go contrary to public policy for the rest of the world, you know. So the interesting thing about the file sharing debate is that it has parallels in every single technological era when the printing press was invented and musical scores didn't have to be copied by hand by monks, there was a fear that this was going to cheapen and dilute music, and that it was then going to be, that the investment that had been made in the musical class would disappear because the common folk would have music, and then the music industry of the day, which was court musicians, would be destroyed, right? And of course that didn't happen. Sheet music getting out into the world made it possible for common people to hear music now and again, and it broadened and whetted their appetite for music, and it made possible things like sitting orchestras, okay? When the player piano was invented, the exact same argument was used. This is going to allow people to hear music in their homes. They're never going to come to a concert hall again. You know, it's going to ruin music. And of course what it did was it educated and enlightened a much larger segment of the audience, who then became music fans, and it made possible, you know, vaudeville, basically. It made possible like live musical performances all across the country. Then when the phonograph came in, the exact same argument was used. Oh, if people can hear music in if they can hear Caruso at home, they're never going to come to see real music. What that did was that it allowed music to travel to a diasporous audience. You could have somebody in Boise, Idaho, who had no hope of ever seeing Caruso, allowed him to hear Caruso, and that would spark an interest in him in serious music. And that created a whole bunch of, that had a carrying on effect of generally speaking, enlarging the audience for music. And it was of a net benefit to performing musicians. The exact same thing happened with radio. Like, band leaders were terrified that people were going to hear a broadcast of a dance band from a ballroom, and then they would just stay home and not come out to the ballroom. And what it did, of course, was that it made people excited about going to the ballroom because they could hear this dance band, and it was really terrific. Hey, let's go down to the Rialto. This is going on right now. And the same thing happened when the cassette was introduced. The music industry fought the cassette, saying, "Oh, people can tape records; they're never going to buy records." Well, no. What happened was that people made cassettes of their favorite records and then sent them to other people or gave them to their friends, which was a promotional tool for their favorite records, and it ended up increasing record sales. And the exact same thing is happening with Napster, or not Napster, but all the other free file sharing services. People are being exposed to music that they wouldn't hear otherwise, and it's developing a taste for it, and it's enlarging that audience. I don't know any working band that is opposed to file sharing on principle. In fact, they all think it's great. I can say that because I don't know Metallica. And the Metallica position is a really perverse one, because in the early 80s, the metal underground the heavy metal underground had no support. Like, there was no radio programs for it, there were very few fanzines for it. It didn't even have a club circuit the way that the punk scene did. So metal was deep underground in the 80s. And the first time I heard Metallica was on a copied cassette, like a copy of their first demo cassette, right? And I heard Metallica, and it struck me as an interesting and an original take on metal, right? So Metallica's entire early audience was developed through this sort of free trading that they are now so adamantly opposed to. Like, they are benefited most directly from this mentality of sharing music you like for free. They have benefited from it enormously, and for them to come out as being opposed to it and actually to try to be punitive about it is ass backwards. They're responsible for their audience deserting them. So. Well, basically, I don't deal with the mainstream music industry, so I didn't feel any pressure. They called me, we booked the studio, we went there and made the record, and that experience, that part of it was totally normal. Like, it was just like any other record I've ever done. We go to the studio, we make the record, they're happy with it, they go home. After that, when the record label finally heard it, that's when it started. That's when everybody started to freak out. And that's when the record label started to try to influence the band and started calling me names and stuff like that. And since I don't care what those people think of me, it didn't really affect me on a personal level, what their opinion of me was. It did begin a kind of an ugly period where I almost went bankrupt, and that was kind of unpleasant. Because the smaller bands that I had been working with were sort of afraid to work with me because they felt that I had graduated into the mainstream in some way and I would no longer be available to them. And then the mainstream bands that might have been interested in working with me, well, seeing the shitstorm that came out after that record came out, there's no way that they were going to be allowed to work with me. So it really did. There are two things that happened. One is that I almost went broke, but the other thing that happened was that it completely ended like the sort of flirtation that the major record labels had had with me. Like there had been a few records that had come up that they'd asked me to work on, where it seemed like, it seemed like they were interested in having me work on the records in a genuine sense. But there were a few times when I could tell I was being approached by stuff that was just pure bullshit. Like they just wanted to stick me on there because somebody mentioned my name somewhere. And that stuff completely ended. So my core clientele, all the basically small underground independent bands, the core clientele eventually came back, and I lived. I, as an engineer, get paid $350 a day. The studios that I work at, Electrical Audio, why, we can go to the booking and rates page. You can see Studio A is $800 a day, and this little box will tell you how long a day is. A day is a good amount of time, apparently. So I get paid $350 a day. I should point out that I don't actually get paid that money. That money that's paid on my behalf goes to Electrical Audio, and I draw a salary from Electrical Audio. My annual salary from Electrical Audio is $24,000 a year. So that's how much money I make as a Grammy-winning engineer. I have 6 gold albums, 3 platinum albums, and 2 Dove Awards. I make $24,000 a year. There's a little session estimate calculator here. You can pick a studio and pick the engineering options and whether you need an assistant and how many minutes of music. That's for calculating tape costs and blah, blah, blah. And you just enter the variables, like you enter how many days you want and all this other stuff, and then it'll tell you how much your session's going to cost. And that, I think, is really important for bands when they're trying to figure out how to book their session. It allows them to figure out precisely how much it's going to cost them to make the record. There are 2 ways that you can look at a sort of a technical program like this. One of them is that it is there to serve the industry of recording, and the other one is that it is there to serve the interests of the students. And in a case like this, clearly it's there to serve the interests of the students. Like, the students want to learn this stuff, so that's why they're in the programs. There are virtually no jobs available in this trade. So when you graduate from MTSU with your degree in engineering or whatever it is, there is virtually no chance that you will be hired for a paying job walking out of it. And I hope I'm not pissing on anybody's campfire here, but it's not the same as it is in most other industries. In most other industries, there is an entrenched industry that has all this stuff going on that you can slot in at the bottom level of and work your way up. In recording, all the big, like the giant institutional studios are all going bankrupt, and they're all disappearing. So these big institutional studios where you could have gotten in at a sort of an entry-level position and worked your way up, the studios don't exist anymore. What exists now are a shit million little one-man and two-man studios that are operating with second-hand equipment and a rented space someplace. That's what the recording industry is now. It's a bunch of people who are individually acting as small studio owners, entrepreneurs, and they and a friend or they and a couple of friends are opening a studio, and that's where records are being made primarily now. So finding those places and getting to work in those places as a freelancer is probably how your career will begin once you leave the academic environment. But there isn't, I mean, if you think that if you thought that there might be like some round of interviews after you graduate, like there would be if you were like a law school guy or whatever. That's not going to happen. And you're welcome to send your resumes to people, but we throw them away, and I think we're a particularly generous studio, so I can't imagine what people do with them elsewhere, you know? Well, no, I mean, if he's happy with the way his guitars sound, then that's the way his guitars sound. You know, that's the end of the sentence. I think you're making a big presumption there that anybody gives a shit who recorded the record. You know, like, that somebody listening to a record, you know, that guitar sounds really muddy. Who engineered this thing anyway? It doesn't happen. I don't think you need to worry about it. And what matters infinitely more than whether or not the guitar tone was killer, in finger quotes, is whether or not they got along with you and whether or not they felt like you treated them square. If you treat a band square and they're not happy with the way the record comes out, but if you treat them square and you give them a chance to voice their opinions and you try your best and you're working with them instead of in opposition to them, they will come back and let you do the good one next time. I know that because I've made crappy records with a lot of bands and they've come back and made a good one, you know. And it's not the case that it's my responsibility to make a good record for this band. My responsibility is to make them the record they want. That's all it boils down to. No, virtually all of the work that I've ever gotten has been from people calling me. And originally it was people within my circle of friends and their friends and all that sort of stuff, just like one-to-one referrals. And to be honest, I think that's the only advertising that really is effective in any way. Like anything else, like, have you ever looked at an ad for a studio and thought, I must go there. This advertisement looks great. You know, it just doesn't. I don't think it enters anybody's mind. I know I've never behaved that way. You know, the only advertising that we've done, Electrical Audio advertises in The Onion. I don't know if you guys get The Onion down here. And the only reason we advertise in The Onion is because we really like it, and we get 25 copies a week as an advertiser, and that way we don't have to send anybody out to get them. You know? And if you like The Onion, you should read The Daily Tennessean, because that is as close to The Onion as there is. I'll tell a little aside here. I was in a band. I'm in this band Shellac. We played a show in Cookeville with the Hose Mobile a couple of years ago, and we stopped at a gas station, and I picked up a copy of The Daily Tennessean. And we had brought a stack of The Onions with us for the tour, so that we could entertain ourselves on the tour. And I was reading the Daily Tennessean, and I couldn't believe that it was for real and not like a good old boy version of The Onion. Like the banner headline was Garth Brooks ends tour, 1,500 out of work. And then there was another story about a dude who was running for state senator or something like that, and he shot his opponent. And then he had argued in court that his opponent's name shouldn't appear on the ballot because he was dead. Like he actually, now that takes some pretty hard balls. And so the Daily Tennessean is as worthy of support as The Onion, I think. Well, it's all going digital whether I like it or not. So me having an opinion about it is immaterial. And I think for informal uses of music, things like the iPod or the Segway or whatever, and satellite radio and internet radio and all that sort of stuff, the convenience of it so dramatically outweighs any critical evaluation of it that it's pointless to have an opinion about it, really. It's so much easier for somebody to carry around 500 songs on an iPod than it is to carry around 500 CDs. Like, of course that's what they're going to do. And you know, you'd be a fool to argue against that. I don't think I would sit down and listen to music for my own entertainment on a system like that. But if I was, you know, on the treadmill at the gym and I just wanted to have, you know, Name something. Garth Brooks going in the background. It seems like a fine idea. Well, I don't really make a distinction between the recording and the mixing. It's all, generally speaking, it's all done in one go. Like, it's rare that somebody shows up to do a recording and then comes back much later to do mixing. I mean, it does happen, but it's rare. It's much more common that it's like one continuous process. I don't work on other people's recordings. Like, it doesn't happen that somebody brings me something that's already recorded and says, mix this. It doesn't happen. And I have tried to do that on a couple of occasions to help people out. Like, somebody had something that was previously recorded, but they never finished it, so they wanted to finish it off and mix it. And I've never really been happy with the results, and I don't think any of my clients have ever really been happy with the results. So I don't consider myself a mixer, in finger quotes. I've always just seen mixing as sort of the end of the recording process rather than a special, separate, black art. And most of mixing is balance. 99% of mixing is getting the fader in the right place and leaving it alone. Well, they're kind of involved. There was a morbidly obese woman and her husband and their son and his boyfriend, and that one was weird. Yeah, as far as the music is concerned, doesn't matter. Like, I really don't. I mean, I've worked on records where the music involved would have been a nightmare if that was all there was, but the session itself was fine, because the people involved were getting good results, and they were happy, and everybody was friendly. I mean, but you wouldn't want to listen to the record, that kind of thing. But when you're working on a record, you don't listen to it in the same way that you do listening to records for fun. When you're listening to records for fun, you get to pick up something that you want to listen to. And when you're working on a record, you're just trying to solve problems. You're trying to get the job done at the moment. And you can be completely engrossed in that, and engrossed to the point where you can't even really tell what it sounds like as music, because you're trying to solve specific problems. And I think it's actually a mark of professionalism to be comfortable working on music that you might otherwise hate, because having an opinion about it at that stage is counterproductive. And there's a parallel here. If you're an auto mechanic, you might have some cars that you prefer to work on other than others. Like, this car was, better put together, or is tidier, or whatever, You might have a preference for working on one kind of car other than others, but you can work on any car. It's not a mystery how they work. And so I think having a preference, I think, is natural, but I also think that it's counterproductive. And I also don't think that it's a good idea when you're an engineer on a session. I don't think it's a good idea to get super wrapped up in the music and get really keyed up about it like a fan. And for the same reason that I don't think a gynecologist should be getting turned on. It's an inappropriate response for the task. It's comprehensible, but it's obviously inappropriate. And that's the way that's the way I think about music. It's like, I want to be able to understand my job on a rational level. I want to be able to know what I'm doing to the sound and what effect it's having. And I want to be able to follow instructions, and I want to be able to, to see through my emotional reaction to the music, right? And I think that's critical, absolutely critical to doing a good job. Whereas if you're just, if you're headbanging and throwing up the horns, then you're not paying attention, you're not doing your job. Digital recording is dependent on the support network of the reading device, the operating system of the computer that it's on, the software that reads the files, the implementation of that software into an audio system, blah, blah, blah. There's a whole lot involved with getting the data off of a digital recording. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. Early digital recording systems were tape-based, and all of those tape formulations were used what's called metal particle tape. And metal particle tape has a tendency to break down into oxide over time, and it loses its coercivity, or becomes less magnetically stable. So virtually all early digital recordings on the 3M system, the bitstream system, the DVX system, the Mitsubishi system, virtually all of those are becoming unreadable. That is, the data is being lost. And once digital data is lost, it's irretrievably lost. There's no way that you can get it back. You can't reconstruct it. Analog recordings, even the very earliest analog recordings from the early 30s, are still perfectly playable now. You can literally bring me any analog recording made at any point in history, and I will play it for you. I guarantee you that I can play it for you. And that's because what subtle degradation there is over time with analog magnetic media is not catastrophic. Like, you might lose a little bit of high frequency response. You might get a little bit more noise. There might be some shedding of the oxide. But the important part, that is being able to play it and hear what it sounds like, that will be there. You might not get full fidelity, but it's also very possible that because playback technologies have improved since the recording technologies earlier, it's possible that you can play it back at a much better resolution than it was recorded with. Like if it was recorded with a certain level of resolution, but the playback systems of the day weren't able to capture it, weren't able to reproduce it, you can play it back now on a high fidelity system and actually play it back hearing it better than it was ever heard before. Digital recording is all frozen with the development of a paradigm. Like, at the point where you make your recording, digital technology has only advanced so far, and there's no way that in the future you'll be able to extract more information out of it. Right? The biggest problem is that there is no long-term solution for storage of digital media. There is no universal sort of Rosetta Stone format for digital audio. There are a whole bunch of competing formats for different types of digital audio. And the reason this is the case is that flexibility in design and proprietary design nature makes software engineers more flexible. It allows them to write better, more flexible, more powerful programs. If they don't have to be compatible with anything else, they can do more with what they're working on. And that's the principal advantage of digital recording, is that it is very powerful and very flexible in terms of the manipulation you can do to sound. The preserving of the recording of that is almost an afterthought, because it's presumed that you'll be working on it intensively for a very short period of time, and then it'll be done. And once it's done, you're not going to want to go back and work on it again in the future. And if history has shown us anything, it's that over time, music that is of value retains its audience and develops a new audience over time. And so there is a point to keeping archival material around. And the big problem is that there is no means of archiving digital recordings. There's no format that you could record it to that you could be sure would be around in the future. The media that you record it to are all susceptible to degradation, and the degradation is more catastrophic than it is in the analog domain. I say that some smarty pants is probably going to say that there is an archival digital format, and you're right. Punched paper tape or paper punch cards are archival digital recording media, but nobody uses them for audio because you could fill this room with the punch cards for one Christina Aguilera song. Well, it's much more expensive to work on one song start to finish and then move on. And it's also, you also create problems that way. And like if you're not in the mood to sing this song, but you've got to sing that song one day, you're stuck with whatever comes out. And most of the bands that I work with are strictly limited by budget. So the most efficient way to do it is to do all the live band recording. And then once you're done with the live band recording, you can do make an awful lot more hodgepodge of it. If you want, you can do an overdub, you can record something, you can mix something. There's really, like once you get to the end of the basic track session, and I say that, you know, along the way, you'd be doing any repairs that you need to do on basic tracks, like any edits that you need to make composite tracks or any drop-ins or whatever. You do those along the way, so that by the time you're finished with all the basic tracks, then you have a menu of other stuff that you can do, overdubs or mixing. And that, at that point, it gets a lot more freeform. But the session normally starts by doing basic track recording. In fact, there's nothing that says you can't be doing a little bit of vocal recording, a little bit of mixing, a little bit of overdubbing every day for the rest of the session. But I say that, you know, but from a practical standpoint, if you've got 9 songs worth of singing to do and it's 8 o'clock and the band has to leave by 2 in the morning, then yeah, they're going to sing all the songs in a row. You know, that's the way it works. There's a hum in this ear. What am I listening to? I've been on kind of a, every year or so I get on this kick of listening to Bill Withers, and I was listening to a lot of Bill Withers last week. Who else? There's the AC/DC live record is really great. I listened to a bit of that the other day. I like, they sound a little bit different. There's a Series 2 in Studio B, which I think has really solid low end. And it sounds really, there's something sort of beefy about the sound of it. It's hard for me to describe, but I think it's really good for rock music. The Elite in Studio A is dead clean, absolutely silent, low noise. I never have to worry about any part of it generating any funny sound, you know? There's nothing special about it, but I think there's no part of it that I'm afraid of. I think the mic amps sound good. I think the equalizers sound good, and yeah, I don't really have any overall perception of them other than that they're easy to work on for me, and I don't. Most consoles, there's like something about them that sucks, like the Neve V consoles, for example. They have all these circus tricks built into the channel that you can do with the sound. And if you push any of those buttons, it goes to hell. You know, if you're just using a simple signal path from the mic amp to the tape, it sounds fine. But if you do anything else, if you turn any of that other stuff on, it goes to hell. The same with the SSL. The SSL, the mic amps sound okay. If you patch out from the mic amp to the tape machine, it sounds fine. But if you go through all the stuff, if you do any of the stuff that they put in there to allow you to freak the sound, it starts to sound crappier with every stage. And so most consoles have something that you can complain about, but I really don't have anything that I can complain about with the Neotex. I think every part of it is fine.